Greetings, one and all. Welcome to Seven Kinds of Mischief. I'm your host, Stone Loki, and with me tonight is the one, the only, the Doctor of Disaster and Destruction, Adega Outlaw. Greetings, brother.
Hello and greetings.
Oh, guys, we have got some epic tales of mischief and mystery, madness, chaos, seduction, death, destruction, terror, torture, whatever we could think up. We are bringing it to you here tonight. So, Adega, what exactly have you brought for us tonight?
I'm going to share with people two inspirations for the story of the Blood Witch. One is historical fact, and one is the prologue to the Blood Witch, which is associated with the historical fact. This is a story that some of you probably know or have heard a little bit about. Her name is Elizabeth Bathory, also known as the Blood Countess, and she was a 16th century Hungarian aristocrat. And right now, she's still ranked in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most murderess of all time.
And Colin P. Smith asks, are you culturally appropriating the Tower of London? Yes, I am, since both of my stories tonight have to do with the Tower of London. So we're going to go with Adega first, as we did last week. Welcome, everyone. I hope you guys are going to have a great time tonight. But we're going to go with Adega first, and he's going to tell his two tales, and I'm going to tell my two tales, and we're going to wrap things up. So without further ado, Adega, man, the floor is yours.
All right. Just heads up, my son's a little noisy in the background, so if you hear him banging around, it's because he's got something important to say and doesn't say it quite as well as he should. But with the Blood Countess, or they call her the Countess of Dracula, and I'm just going to read it for you guys. It seems that the Carpathian killer, whose fear of aging knew no reasonable bounds, figured that beauty... Oh, you're playing the music now? Okay.
Oh, I thought you.
Nah, it was for the other story, but that's okay.
Okay. Well, we can do it for the other story. That's fine.
She figured a beauty wash in blood would stem the onslaught of years. Elizabeth Bathory was born the turn of the 17th century Eastern Europe as an aristocrat who believed that bathing in blood of virgins would maintain her youthful looks. Apparently, some 600 young women came to a premature end in order to keep her macabre fountain of youth flowing. How far people will go to secure eternal youth. Cleopatra bathed in milk. The former Indian Prime Minister Morjar Desai regularly drank his own urine, and Michael Jackson had his face rebuilt. No one, however, has gone as far as the 16th century Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, thought to have murdered 600 girls so that she could smother herself in their blood in an attempt to retain her youth and beauty. The accepted story is that Elizabeth, stunningly beautiful, was raised as a maigre royale. At 15, she was married off for political gain and became the lady of the castle Kostek. It's Hungarian, I'm sorry. Deep in the Carpathian Mountains, now eastern Slovakia. In this picturesque setting, on small fields, quaint cottages, and scampering goats, a horror of unimaginable proportions was about to unfold. Elizabeth's husband, a soldier, was far off on various campaigns, and life for her was poundingly boring. She began to interest herself in the occult and to invite people claiming to be witches, sorcerers, and alchemists to the castle. They taught her the craft in intimate detail, and she was enthralled. Elizabeth's husband had a torture device as he He used it to extract information from Turkish prisoners. It was comprised of a silver claw-like pincers fastened to a whip to tear off flesh. When he went on campaigns, he left this behind, and Elizabeth began to while her ways and hours using it on debtors thrown into their dungeons. When her husband died, Elizabeth longed for her lover to be When her husband had died, Elizabeth longed for a lover to replace him. But she was 43 and realized she had aged, and her angelic complexion had faded, which put her into a smoldering rage. She was next in line to become a ruler of Poland and desperately wanted the job, as she was a woman far more educated than those around her, speaking 4 languages, while the Prince of Transylvania was an illiterate boor. Maintaining her youth and vitality became central to this developing plot. Vanity, sexual desire, and the thirst for political power combined into a frenzied obsession for Elizabeth. She knew that without youth and beauty, she would forfeit everything. Her mood deteriorated, and one day, as she struck a servant girl for a minor oversight, she drew blood, some of which splattered on Elizabeth's skin. Later, she was convinced that that part of her arm where the girl's blood had dropped looked fresher and younger. For a woman who believed in magic, there was an obvious conclusion. Her complexion had improved because the young girl's blood was full of spirit of life. Blood was an elixir of youth, and if nature was going to steal her youth, she would take it back from others. When she consulted her alchemists, they agreed with her, and Elizabeth was convinced she had discovered the secret to eternal youth. With her trusted helper and other sorceresses, she roamed the countryside by night, hunting suitable young virgins. They were dragged back to the castle and hung upside down by chains around their ankles, naked and still alive. Their throats were slit, and blood drained for Elizabeth's bath. When there was a really lovely young girl, Elizabeth would drink her blood from a golden flask, but as her taste for this depravity increased, she drank directly from the stream of blood, as the writhing bodies hung from the rafters. From then on, killing became a ritual. As the blood dripped to the stone floor, Elizabeth would smear it all over herself, the smell seeming to intoxicate her. She would kneel by the victim, tearing at their flesh with her teeth and sucking the wound. With 3 or 4 girls stretched out on the floor, she would wallow ankle deep in the blood. Although she had held off her political foes, after 5 years of this madness, Elizabeth realized the blood of the peasant girls was having no effect on her skin. She decided that the blood must be defective, and better blood was required. With the incredible cunning she had, she established an academy in the castle, offering to take 25 girls at a time from cultivated families and finish their education. These students were consumed in the same way as the peasant girls that had preceded them. It was at this point that Elizabeth became careless for the first time in her horrific career. During a frenzy of lust, 4 drained bodies were thrown from the walls of the castle, and the error was realized too late. The villagers had already seen and identified the girls, and the secret was out. The mystery of where these girls had gone began to be solved. Word of this horror rapidly spread and reached the Hungarian Emperor Matthias II, who ordered the Countess placed on public trial. Her aristocratic status meant she could not be arrested by Parliament, so Parliament passed a new act to remove this privilege, and Elizabeth was brought before a formal hearing in 1610. By the final count, 600 girls had vanished, yet Elizabeth admitted nothing. Her assistant and sorcerers were burned alive, but the Countess, because of her noble birth, could not be executed. Instead, she was damned to a living death, sealed in a tiny cupboard in the castle, and never let out. She died 4 years later, without a single word of remorse. That is Countess Bethany. Now, I told you I was going to read the prologue. This is the book that is going to be coming out next year. This is the one that publishers wanted. This prologue is loosely based. You will see very much a lot of similarities to it, to the story of the Countess. And as I always do when I read my stuff, here we go. He was a faithful servant, always filling his mistress's wishes, her needs and desires. Upon opening the upper room to where his mistress resided night after night, he so gently ushered in the peasant girl, nearly 19 summers. The girl hoped to please the mistress. It would ensure her family wouldn't starve this summer. She came being promised a fair wage to be issued to her parents and siblings. They could buy food and coal for the hard months. They heard the stories of the mistress. She would reward the families of the girls with coin enough for years. The girls were sent away to far-off schools for education and often marriage, though none of the girls returned to share in what they had gained. This new lass heard the door shut softly behind her on this dark night. The room was empty of all but a few candles standing for light and an ornate tall black chair. In its comfort sat the mistress. Her presence was foreboding, though she had a kind smile. The warmth of the room was comforting, since it had been several days since the girl's bones had been warmed by a fire. The mistress stood, revealing her thin gown and strong features, her smile growing slightly. Approaching the girl with slow steps that made no sound on the bare hardwood walnut floor, her smile grew. Now even the young lass felt the smile, though it was somewhat unsettling, being alone with a half-dressed woman of such power and influence. The mistress stopped within arm's reach, considering the girl's hair. She brushed both sides gently to reveal her ears that had grown blue from the cold. "Don't worry, my dear child. You will never be cold again." These words meant so much to the starving young lass. She didn't mind as the mistress drew closer, dropped her gown to reveal her sacred parts. There was an embrace, but no warmth was shared, for the mistress was cold as ice. "I love you, dear child." These words brought no comfort, for at this phrase, the spine of the young girl was split in two. Her youthful blood pooled at the mistress's feet, fracturing even more. The now dead child, her bowels spilled on the stained hardwood floor. The mistress bathed in the blood, rolled in the torn flesh, saying, "I still love you, my child." Tears formed in the mistress's eyes, now that her young love was gone and her body drawn cold. Outside the door, her faithful servant walked away to find another girl for his mistress. To find another monster, let me read that again, sorry. Outside the door, her faithful servant walked away to find another girl for his monster mistress to love until death. He said, "It's a strange kind of love." Sorry for the mishap there at the very end. You hear the song in the background. That is what inspired that prologue. There was another song later that started the whole book. But either way, hopefully you could see the close ties based on Elizabeth Bathory, a real vampire, a real story.
Brother, that was absolutely outstanding. Absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
It's all fun.
And Jester of Sin has become a YouTube member. Thank you so very much, Jester of Sin. He is a member of Loki's army. Thank you so very much, Jester. And brother, one big one for you here. Skull!
There it is! It's beautiful! Take your hat off, boy. That's a dollar bill.
Thank you so very much, Jester of Sin, for joining Loki's army, brother. Thank you. You guys keep the fires burning bright here in Valhalla. Thank you guys so very much. My two stories tonight are a little different than Adega's, but share some of the shock of what people are capable of. In the 1070s, when William the Conqueror built a mighty stone tower at the center of his London fortress, Londoners must have looked on in awe. Now, nearly 1,000 years later, the tower still has the capacity to fascinate and horrify. As protector of the crown jewels, home of the Omen Warders and its legendary guardians, the Pampered Ravens, the tower now attracts over 3 million visitors a year. Here, the ceremony of the keys and other traditions live on, as do the ghost stories and terrible tales of torture and execution. Two of those stories I'm going to read for you tonight. One starts with Father John Garrard, who was a spy. In November 1588, he was among a team of 4 Jesuit priests sent from Rome and secretly landed on the shores of England with the mission of making contact with and ministering to that country's Roman Catholic community. He joined a clandestine network of Catholic operatives controlled from their headquarters in London. Born in England, Father Gerard mingled easily among English society, passing himself off as a gentleman of leisure. It was a dangerous existence, as evidenced by the fact that Father Gerard's 3 companions in the landing party were eventually discovered and executed. Gerard remained undetected for 6 years until his betrayal by a servant in the household in which he was staying. After 3 years in captivity, he was taken to the Tower of London, where he was subjected to torture in an effort to force him to confess that his mission was to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and to reveal the identity of the leader of the spy ring. Despite the pain, he refused to divulge any information. In the words of Valhalla, he would not kneel. On the night of October 4th, 1597, he made a daring escape from the tower with the help of friends on the outside. He slipped into the English countryside and remained undiscovered for another 8 years. Finally, with the attempt to blow up Parliament and the discovery of gunpowder plot in 1605, the political atmosphere became too dangerous. Father Gerard slipped out of the country and sailed to the European continent, disguised as a member of the Spanish diplomatic mission. Father Gerard wrote a book detailing his adventures shortly after his escape from Europe. He described his torture in the Tower of London. We went to the torture room in a kind of procession, the attendants walking ahead with lighted candles. The chamber was underground and dark, particularly near the entrance. It was a vast place, and every device and instrument of human torture was there. They pointed out some of them to me and said I would try them all. Then he asked me again, would I confess? I cannot, I said. I fell on my knees for a moment's prayer, then they took me to a big upright pillar, one of the wooden posts which held the roof of this huge underground chamber. Driven into the top of it were iron staples for supporting heavy weights. Then they put my wrists into iron gauntlets and ordered me to climb 2 or 3 wicker steps. My arms were then lifted up, and an iron bar was passed through the rings of one gauntlet, then through the staple and rings to the second gauntlet. This done, they fastened the bar with a pin to prevent it from slipping, and then, removing the wicker steps one by one from under my feet, they left me hanging by my hands and arms fastened above my head. The tips of my toes, however, still touched the ground, and they had to dig the earth away from under them. They had hung me up from the highest staple in the pillar, and I could not raise my hands any higher without driving in another staple. Hanging like this, I began to pray. The gentleman standing around me asked whether I was willing to confess now. I cannot, and I will not, I answered. But I could hardly utter the words. Such a gripping pain came over me. It was worse in my chest and belly. My hands and arms, all the blood in my body seemed to rush up into my arms and hands, and I thought that blood was oozing from the end of my fingers and the pores of my skin. But it was only a sensation caused by my flesh swelling above the irons holding them. The pain was so intense that I thought I could not possibly endure it. And added to it, I had an interior temptation. Yet I did not feel any inclination or wish to give them the information they wanted. The Lord saw my weakness within the eyes of his mercy and did not permit me to be tempted beyond my strength. With the temptation, he sent me relief. Seeing my agony and the struggle going on in my mind, he gave me this most merciful thought. The utmost and worst they can do is kill you. And you have often wanted to give your life for your Lord God. The Lord God sees all you are enduring. He can do all things. You are in God's keeping. With these thoughts, God in his infinite goodness and mercy gave me the grace of resignation. And with the desire to die and a hope I admit that I would, I offered him myself to do with me as he wished. From that moment, the conflict in my soul ceased, and even the physical pain seemed much more bearable than before. Though it must, in fact, I am sure, have been greater with the growing strain and weariness of my body. Sometime after 1 o'clock, I think, I fell into a faint. How long I was unconscious, I don't know, but I think it was long. The men held my body up or put the wicker steps under my feet until I came to. Then they heard me pray and immediately let me down again. And they did this every time I fainted, 8 or 9 times that day, before it struck 5. A little later, they took me down. My legs and feet were not damaged, but it was a great effort to stand upright. On this day in history, 18th June, 1546, the Protestant martyr and poet Anne Askew was found guilty of heresy and condemned to be burned at the stake at Smithfield. Anne Askew's background was she was born in 1520, some say 1521, in Lincolnshire. She was a noblewoman, being the daughter of Sir William Askew, and was well educated. Karen Lindsay, author of Divorce Beheaded Survived, writes of how Anne was affected by the Protestant ideas that her brothers, who were students at Cambridge, would talk about when they came home to visit, but that the Askew family were conservatives and Anne's father opposed the rebels during the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1537. It was the Pilgrimage of Grace that Lindsay gives as a reason for Anne turning her back on the old religion, because Anne saw the rebels attack her home and seize her brothers. At around this time, Anne was forced to marry Thomas Kyne. Kyne had originally been betrothed to Anne's older sister Martha, but when she died, Anne was offered as a replacement. It's not a happy union. Keim was traditional in his religious views, and Anne, by this time, had strong Protestant views. Anne survived the early days of her marriage by spending time with her sister, Jane, who was married to a Protestant, George St. Paul. St. Paul was friends with Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and his wife, Catherine, who was a supporter of religious reform. From 1538 to 1543, the law allowed normal parishioners access to the English Bible in churches and those of Protestant learnings. It took the opportunity to conduct Bible readings and share their evangelical views, and was one of those people. Henry VIII did an about turn in 1543 and passed an act which prevented all women and men below the rank of gentlemen from reading the Bible. However, this did not prevent people like Anne from sharing their views and preaching because they had memorized scripture. In fact, this law made Anne even more determined to share Bible knowledge with those who were deprived from reading the Bible themselves. Keim, a traditional conservative, could not and would not cope with this outspoken wife, a woman who even refused to take his name. So advised by his local priest, he kicked her out of the family home. Anne simply moved in with her brother Francis and petitioned for divorce. Her petition was denied by her local court, so Anne headed to London, where she was convinced that she would get her divorce. While in London, Anne met up with an old friend and neighbor, John Lascelles, a man of Protestant persuasion, and it was he who introduced her to people like Hugh Latimer, Bishop of Worcester, Nicholas Shaxton, Bishop of Salisbury, and Dr. Edward Crombe. These men were not only high-profile Protestants, they were also connected to Henry's new queen, Catherine Parr. Anne flourished with the support of such friends and the climate of reform in London, and quickly, exuberantly, she became one of London's most famous and beloved gospelers. Her beauty and high rank marking her as a fair gospeler. She had found her home, and soon all London had heard about the lovely young gentlewoman who talked equally with servants and masters, who had such thorough knowledge of God's word, who spoke with such intense conviction. Unfortunately, although some of London was open to reform and fell in love with this passionate woman, Anne was making enemies. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a Catholic conservative, was looking to discredit the new queen, Catherine Parr, and deal with the Protestant climate that seemed to surround her. Anne was not the only one outspoken heretic stirring up the people of London. She was also linked to Catherine Brandon, the Duchess of Suffolk, who was a good friend of the queen. Perhaps Anne could be used to bring down the queen. In June of 1545, Anne Askew and a few other Protestant sympathizers were rounded up and arrested for heresy, but later released due to lack of evidence and witnesses. A few months later, in early 1546, Anne's petition for divorce was dismissed, and the court ordered her to return to Keim, something which Anne refused to do. Lindsay writes of how Anne's refusal to return to her husband was just the weapon that Gardiner needed. Although she had been arrested again in March of 1546 and again released, Gardiner summoned her to London to order her to return to her husband and use this opportunity to question Anne on her religious beliefs. Anne no longer attempted to evade admitting her own beliefs. She treated this as a joke. Of course, Jesus has said he was the bread. He had also said he was the door to salvation. Did that mean he was present in any door a priest chose to bless? She was courting martyrdom. And on June 18th, she was condemned to die at the stake. As well as being known for her gospel preaching and death at the stake, Anne Askew is also famed for being the only recorded woman to have been tortured in the Tower of London. After being condemned to death, Anne was taken to the Tower of London, where she was subjected to torture on the rack at the hands of Gardiner's right-hand men, Sir Richard Rich and Sir Thomas Wreathley. Even though she had already been condemned to death, she was racked because Gardiner was determined to link Anne to the Queen's friends, women like Catherine Brandon, Anne Calthrope, and Anne Stanhope. And Anne was refusing to name names during interrogation. She, as well as we, will not kneel. Because Anne had already been condemned and she was a gentlewoman, lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Anthony Kingston, refused to continue racking her after the first turn. He left the Tower in search of Henry VIII to inform him of this illegal and appalling torture and to seek a pardon for letting it happen. This did not stop Rich. They simply racked the poor woman themselves until they were stopped by Kingston, who informed them that the king had ordered that Anne should be taken off the rack and returned to her prison cell. On the 16th of July, 1546, Anne Askew, John Lascelles, and 2 other Protestants were burned at the stake at Smithfield. Anne had to be carried to the stake on a chair because of her injuries from racking, and the stake had a seat to support her body. As the fire was piled high around them, Ridley made his way through the throng to offer the 4 a pardon if they recanted. Anne spoke for them all, crying aloud that she came not hither to deny my lord and master. The torch was lit, and the 4 died quickly thanks to gunpowder a friend had thrown into the flames. A fortuitous thunderstorm, breaking out suddenly, added to the legend that grew to surround the death of the fair gospeler. The thunder, the 18th century historian John Strype tells us, seemed to the people to be the voice of God or the voice of an angel. There is no doubt that Anne Askew was a martyr. She was just 25 years old when she died, but lived an amazing life in an age where women were supposed to be submissive and have no voice or opinions of their own. She was an outspoken preacher and died for her faith, remaining true to her friends and beliefs, whatever the cost. To me, the fact that things like this are overlooked, things like this are forgotten, things like this are ignored. Strong women have lived throughout history. Some have been evil. Some have been cruel. Some have been fair and beautiful on the inside. But today we're told that things like this didn't exist. We're meant to believe that no one, except in the last 5 years, has been a strong, independent woman. People would have you believe that only now this revolution has taken place. Only now that the time has come for these movements to take place. This is when it's happened. Nerdholic, yes. And there are those out there who think we're living in the worst time in history. Yeah. Nah. Women have more rights today than they've ever had in the history of the world. And yet, some of them believe that it's the worst time. I think that story about Anne exemplifies the fact that for, at the very least, the last 1,000 years, there have been women that say exactly what we say on the show every morning. We will not kneel. We will not bow down. Strong women have been around for millennia. More than that. Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, Anne, just to name a few real life women, kick some major fucking ass. To be tortured like that. I know men that would be put on that rack that would give. They'd give just for it to stop. And she didn't. She didn't kneel. She didn't kneel. She didn't beg. Cleopatra wouldn't either. Joan of Arc didn't either. Whether you're talking about cruel people, whether you're talking about heroes, anti-heroes, villains, doesn't matter. Strong, independent women have lived throughout history. The people today that we rally against, what Loki likes to call them blue-haired land whales, they have no idea. They don't accept it. Because only when they've rewritten history to their own liking and they've made themselves out to be weak, defenseless creatures, do they feel they have any value. And died, burned at the stake. That's some shit, folks.
There's a certain conviction that comes to every soul when you actually have the positive affirmation and the truth inside your mind and your very being that allows you to go beyond what the normal or what the common would do. To be able to, even like when she was dying at the stake, not deny. Where others will cave and bend and cry and cower. The rightness of the cause when it sets into the mind, so long as it is right, and it isn't based on delusions, because a lot of people, and we see them now, they go out and hiss and fight and gather in groups. And that's where they get their strength from, is from the groupthink. Not being able to take responsibility for your own thoughts and actions, but blend in. And thinking that that type of force is anything worth standing for. And you send in a few police and they run and cower. Like a certain terrorist that was captured in a cave not too long ago ran and hid behind his wife and kids before the dogs got him. I don't need to mention any names.
Yeah.
Because the conviction wasn't there. It wasn't right. And he knew he was deluding himself to make excuses for bad actions. But you have a 16-year-old girl who leads the French army and never once doubted. And no one ever had any real accusations against her. And yet Joan of Arc died with conviction. At 16 years old. How much older are we? And yet, how strong are we? You know, do you have those convictions? Don't kneel. Not when you're right. The power's in you regardless. That's what scares these children that run around. Even if they're in their 30s, they have never grown up for logical reasoning and logical thought. these stories of people that were tortured and died in towers. You think of the Knights Templar on Friday the 13th, when the Grand Templar was burnt slowly alive. I don't know how people feel about Templars, but in a lot of ways they have a lot of good about them. Maybe not all of them, but certainly not the King of France who ordered them all killed.
And why? Fear. One little 16-year-old girl had so much power.
Yeah.
One group of people had so much power. Fear. Don't be afraid. You know, I've told people over and over and again, if you want to speak your mind, if you want to stand up and be heard, get on your microphone and do it. Get on your microphone. Don't worry what you have, whether you have a cell phone, whether you have a computer, whether you have an old laptop, whatever you've got, it'll be enough. Trust me. I've been doing this for a year now. I've been streaming almost a year now. You don't have to have all the fancy toys Loki has. All you need is a microphone and your voice. That's good enough. Be heard. Speak your mind. Don't be afraid.
And don't be afraid of the size of the audience, too. If one person, just one person, is affected, and that being yourself, because you were able to relay to the world, even though someone may not be listening. But you're able to stand up and relay your beliefs without fear. Or maybe you have a little bit of fear, but you're the stronger person if you overcome it and do it anyway. Then the world is a better place, even if it's just you listening to your own voice. If there's 3, so much the better. It doesn't have to be thousands to change your world. It just has to be one.
Damn straight. Thank you all so very much for being here with us tonight. Thank you so very much. I hope you enjoyed this. We will be back next Thursday for some more tales from history of mischievous and mysterious and torturous things. Please, if you like this, if you like me and Adega doing this, please leave us a thumbs up. If you like the channel, please ring that bell, subscribe and ring that bell. Thank you so very much. Lady Miss Chris Persia, Nerdholics, Jedi Bill 797, Colin P. Smith, Purple Valkyrie, thank you so much for being here. Jester of Sin, again, thank you for joining Loki's army. Thank you so very much, Jester. Saucy Wench, Banner of Fire, Chris Persia, hail brother, thank you so much for being here tonight and wrenching. Joseph Nash, thank you for dropping in, brother. Mark the Infinitely Tired, Spike and Madness, thank you all so very much. RR, good evening, RR. Luis Sparrow, thank you. DD Myers, thank you. Thank you all so very much, and we will catch you all next Thursday. You guys have a great night, and I will be back with Friday, closing out the week with Dave, Bob, and Loriana Creel tomorrow. Hope to see you all there.
Good night, everyone.
Everyone have a great night, and good night.
These videos are tremendous. Like, comment, and subscribe, and hammer that notification bell.